The people who came to the dungeon had been defeated in another battle, and now they were bringing out their wounded. It was hard for them, but they had to endure. The soldiers could barely move with their bandaged feet. Some of them kept falling down because it was so hard to walk. Suddenly, another soldier fainted, and he was not the first to fall. The surviving soldiers realized that at this rate, the healer would have no mana left to heal. They were worried that all of them might die like this. However, others, more resilient and hardy, were indignant so that others would not say nonsense that everything would be fine.
Suddenly, a warrior who had lost consciousness got up and said that there was still hope for the Empire.
Because the hero Burn is here with them in the terrible dungeon. And now Burn himself came forward and said that if they have enough strength for empty talk, it means that things are not so bad yet. They will definitely hold out. Everything will be fine. They will break through. To which the soldiers boldly replied that they would try. Burn noted for himself that things were bad because everyone was getting too excited. From the very beginning, 74 soldiers participated in the raid. But because of the huge losses due to the endless battles, only 43 are now following him. But the most important thing about all of this is not that they lost 31 men. It is the fact that the 43 fighters still have hearts beating. They have hope. And they need to be brought out of here alive at all costs. In every battle, all the soldiers gave their best, used all their military skills and abilities. Unfortunately, they were unable to protect their 31 comrades. And Burn understood perfectly well that this was the case. No one wanted it to happen. Everyone did everything they could. He reassured his conscience that it could not have been otherwise, because they were all ready for it. The soldiers were in one of the 7 dungeons of great evil, and this was the most terrible of all the dungeons which people could not conquer. Eternal darkness and uncertainty reign here. It has not been studied for sure because it is impossible to go through it completely. Suddenly, Burn's train of thought was interrupted by someone's voice. One of the soldiers asked the hero to look at something. A strange passage opened up in the dark hall like a portal. But it was exactly the passage they all wanted to reach. Finally, they were there. It was the end of the core of antiquity. This was the end point of the adventure after the exorbitant sacrifices that humanity and Burn's group in particular had made. This was the place in the dungeon where an incredible amount of treasure and jewelry was stored. Perhaps even the 36 masterpieces, the greatest works ever created by man, were kept here. In addition, this is where the dungeon boss lives. You have to fight him to conquer the underworld. Burn was the first to step through this so-called door. Something immediately alerted him. He shouted to his soldiers behind him to immediately take up their positions and be ready for another attack. He ordered the tanks and swordsmen to move forward and the magicians to light up the area to ensure that everyone could see. The 2 mages heard that the noise had stopped suddenly. They decided to try to increase their range of vision and warned everyone to be on the lookout. The glowing balls flew upward to illuminate as large an area as possible. It became lighter. This light woke up a huge monster, which turned out to be sleeping here and seemed to be waiting for people to come. It opened its terrible mouth, and now everyone saw that they were almost close to the terrible monster. There were shouts that everyone should run away immediately because this monster could not be killed easily. After all that, another monster named Patrick told his boss that a bunch of people had come while his master was sleeping. But, despite the fact that the master was very tired, he fought them with dignity. The monster asked him if he understood everything correctly, and he received an affirmative answer. The monster roared that this time both people and his own body were against him. It sighed heavily in weakness, for it was very exhausted from the previous battles. The monster told Patrick not to worry too much and to calm down. Patrick was very surprised at this, wondering how he could just calm down. Did the master think that after such a trick he could calm down? He began to scream and shout to his master's common sense that he was the boss of the dungeon. But for some reason he allowed himself to sleep until people got close to him and peered around the corner. Patrick continued to be indignant that all his master had done was yawn in front of those people. Did he really think that this was the way it should be? He shouted furiously that discipline was needed here. And he asked Renee what she thought. Was it right or not? and she replied that she didn't even know what the right thing to do was. Instead, she enthusiastically said that the boss stunned people with a single yawn. She told Swallow that she was once again completely subdued by his majesty. Patrick listened in disappointment as Renee admired his master. He himself was in love with her, but he realized that his love was not reciprocated, and so it was time to accept it. But it was so hard. Patrick held his head and whimpered that this dungeon would soon come to an end. And Swallow laughed at him, saying that if he worried so much his head would explode. There is one of the 7 dungeons of great evil that humanity does not hope to conquer. And that 7th dungeon is the dungeon called the Core of Antiquity. Since ancient times, most dungeon raids end in victory for humans. The monsters inhabiting those dungeons must always be ready to block people coming there. People are ready to attack at any time because they raid dungeons, and the monsters' positions are actually very unfair. Ultimately, the dungeon itself becomes more and more weak as that war goes on. But in the world, dungeons are conquered, and new ones are always appearing instead. Of course, there are exceptions among all of them, which is a completely natural factor. And it is these exceptions that people cannot conquer and are defeated every time. These are the dungeons of great evil, or rather 7 dungeons of great evil. These 7 dungeons of great evil are considered to be beyond humanity's reach. Many raids have been made there, and all of them have been defeated by humans. Among the 7 known dungeons of immense evil, the Core of Ancient is the most difficult demonic dungeon. It is here, in the Core of Antiquity, that dozens of alien creatures live, guarding the dungeon. There are also doormen guarding the 3 intersections of the dungeon. Among them, there is a homunculus guarding the red road on the left. This is the maid with Renee's blade. There's a skeleton guarding the central blue road, the Death Knight Patrick. There is no exact information about the 3rd contaminated road on the right. Nothing is known about it at the moment. It is guarded by some unidentified tentacles. But there is also a main boss that dominates them all. It is the primordial monster that appears in the 1st chapter of the Imperial myth. It's a whole book of myths that describes everything about the dungeons and people, and all the battles that were fought between monsters and people. Renee noted that, as Swallow had warned, after such books spread among people, the number of people wishing to enter the dungeons increased immensely. To this, Swallow said that, as it turned out, dungeon management also requires the use of the brain. And being just mystical and mysterious is not an option at all, because in this case people will not even try to conquer the dungeon. He said that it was enough to tell a small part of the truth in the books to make people interested and think that they already knew enough about how everything was built there. And so, as soon as people saw a book that described the laws of the dungeon, no matter how half-fictional, they immediately rushed to it, like night moths to a fire that began to burn them immediately. Although Swallow admitted that he had not expected such a crowd, he began to recall this last raid of people, how many of them were there from the very beginning. And there were 74 of them. However, most of their equipment had melted during the battle with the 116 black tentacles, so they were of no use anymore. All good and worthwhile equipment is quite expensive. Renee was upset. She said that she could have processed them carefully without leaving any defects. Sullivan certainly agreed, but as it happened, so it happened. He took the form of a human, patted her on the head, saying that Renee could really do it so neatly. Renee blushed at this recognition and giggled softly. Then Patrick broke down and nervously asked if they were all really here for a conference or just to have fun. And why were only Swallow and Renee having fun? What about the others, including himself? He shouted to them that they were so sweet that he would soon get tooth decay from them. But he is afraid that not only his teeth will rot from all this, but also his whole head. It's all so sugary. Patrick said to Sullivan that if he was going to change his body in the future, he should do it in a normal way. Because he had just stroked Renee's head with a hand with 6 fingers. Swallow looked at his human hand and counted 6 fingers on it. However, Patrick continued that the boss was making progress in his transformation. Because last time, when he saw 40 teeth, he got goosebumps when Swallow, smiling brightly, said that the transformation was successful. Renee then said that the sound of Patrick's rattling chin was too loud. She threatened him with her fist if he didn't stop. Patrick was outraged and told everyone to go to hell, saying that he needed to get rid of his dungeon doorman job as soon as possible. Renee came to her senses and abruptly changed the subject. Holding some papers in her hands, she said that they had to get down to business. They were here for a conference after all. Everyone sat down at a round table, and Renee began her speech by saying that everyone probably already knew that people had finally started to invade the dungeon through the right-hand door. But their problem was that the owner of the 116 black tentacles was seriously injured. He looked too critical. Swallow replied that they shouldn't worry too much about it because the tentacles regenerate much faster than they think. So we need to wait a while longer. And if the situation does not improve, they will find a replacement for this doorman. Here, Patrick said that if the boss is looking for a replacement for one doorman, he should look for two at once, because he also wants to resign. To this, Swallow said that it was out of the question because Patrick had a lifetime contract. Swallow also noted that in any case, from now on, people would be able to enter the dungeon only through the right-hand door. Patrick said that there is a possibility that people are already forming new teams for this purpose. Renee said that these days people are quite actively using communication magic like telepathy. That's why the information that there was a chance on the right contaminated path to the dungeon must have already spread among people. Swallow had a fresh idea for the situation. He said that now they would have to plan their entire strategy accordingly. And he suggested that they change positions. Swallow turned to Renee, who had been defending the left red path, and said that from now on she would defend the right path. The strategy was that people would think that the right path was free, they would go there, and Renee would show them where the crayfish hibernate. Renee, delighted by this recognition, replied that she would gladly protect the dungeon, regardless of the number of people who would invade it. Swallow continued to talk about his plans and said, turning to Patrick, that the left red path, which Renee had been defending until now, would be defended by him. However, Patrick did not like this idea. He asked why it was he who should defend the left red path. Swallow replied that people who recognize that Renee is on the contaminated path will take the left red path, which she originally defended, but it will be Patrick who will meet them there. It will be a surprise for people. In this way, they will all be able to defend themselves against two invasions at once. But Patrick continued to question and clarify. He asked what would happen if people decided to take the central blue path. There is no one there to protect them, but Sullivan had foreseen such an option. According to his plan, he would personally defend the blue central path. He will calmly deal with anyone who wants to step on that path. Patrick did not like that plan at all. Renee, on the other hand, was incredibly enthusiastic about the strategy. Therefore, Patrick had no choice but to agree to the new plan to defend the dungeon. Renee continued the conference. She noted that they had already dealt with the urgent matters to some extent. Now it was time to figure out what to do with the sword. Swallow tiredly asked what kind of sword the maid was asking about. Patrick answered this question. He said that it was the sword used by the leader of the last raid. Patrick also added that it seemed that the people who invaded the dungeon this time must have been quite strong if they carried such a sword. Swallow asked what kind of sword it was. Patrick told him that he must have heard of it too. He pointed to the sword lying next to them. This sword is one of the 36 masterpieces that people have made, and these swords are quite popular among them. Patrick also told me that there are masterpieces that are not purely weapons. In short, this sword is among them. It seems to be the 14th in a row, and apparently it is called Tanabella. Swallow scratched the back of his head and said he remembered 36 shavers or something. It seems there are several similar masterpieces in the vault. Renee picked up her blade and said that it was also one of the 36 masterpieces. Swallow thought about it. It bothered him a little that people were walking around with pretty good weapons. Then they need to decide what to do and how to act in this situation. Patrick said that if they gave the sword to the guys at the entrance, people would take it back. So they will have problems again. He suggested that it would be better if the boss kept the sword. To this, Sullivan said that Patrick is a great swordsman, so let him take it for himself. This threw Patrick off balance. He was very surprised by this offer. He asked excitedly if the boss really thought so. Then he laughed nervously and said that if the boss was so insistent, then let it be. After all, here in the dungeon there are monsters such as a terrible maid, a homunculus with a blade, and Patrick, the Knight of Death, who emits the energy of death. And then there's the huge ancient monster Sallow. Here, Swallow turned to Patrick to tear up the letter of resignation that he had hidden between his ribs. A great team to defend the 5 dungeons, the determined Renee and the only conscience of the dungeon, as well as the master of telling off the boss, Patrick. And in addition, the ancient monster Swallow, the embodiment of laziness. Later, Renee asked how they would distribute the remaining income, and Patrick, looking at the sword he had been given, thought to himself that it would be enough for him. Swallow suggested that they do everything as usual. This means taking everything they can, and whatever they didn't need they would simply use as bait for the next group. Renee then suggested that she would take care of all the details herself, to which the bomb agreed wholeheartedly, and Patrick thought she was freeloading again. However, Renee pointed out that monsters can't use magic weapons, so she suggested that they remove the magic stones and sell them. They could fetch a lot of money. Swallow took up the offer. He was a little surprised and said that it was quite acceptable. He suggested that he should finally go to town, for the first time in a long time. Renee and Patrick were stunned by this proposal. It scared them quite a bit. Instead, Swallow asked why they were so surprised by what he wanted to do. Stammering, Patrick suggested that maybe it would be better to let Renee go to town. Swallow asked why. Patrick replied that it was because the boss was not good at turning into a human being yet. He added that even now his tail was sticking out. Renee looked at Patrick with reproach. Patrick asked what was wrong with that, since he was telling the truth. Swallow agreed to let Renee go to town, but told her to pick up some goodies on the way. So Renee got ready to go. The weather was beautiful that day. She walked easily. And then in this beautiful weather she had a fresh idea. She politely said goodbye to her boss, saying she would be back soon. Renee walked to a jewelry store and asked the shopkeeper to buy her gems. The shopkeeper carefully examined the stones and said that unfortunately he could not buy them. This conclusion made Renee very angry. She asked why he could not buy the gems. Then the shopkeeper bent under the table to get something. He pulled out one of his stones on the table and told Renee to look at it carefully. He went on to say that it was a grade B stone. To acquire a stone like this, they, the commoners, have to work hard for 10 years. And the stones Renee brought were much more expensive. Such stones can only be used by mages of the Imperial Palace or high-class mages. And, for example, a jeweler in the capital who has an agreement with the imperial family. And also the wing tower of magicians could dispose of them. Therefore, Renee noted for herself that she needed to go to the capital and to the wing tower with her stones. But the capital was quite far away, so it was better to go to the wizard tower now. Renee really didn't want to go to the Tower of Magicians, but for the sake of her beloved Mr. Swallow, she would do anything. She politely said goodbye to the shopkeeper, thanking him for his advice, and left the store. The shopkeeper warned her to be careful. Then he noticed that one of the stones Renee had brought was still on the table. So he shouted after her to come back because he had forgotten it, and he didn't want other people's things. Instead, Renee looked back and said that it was his tip. It was her way of thanking him for the information he had provided. The shopkeeper was quite surprised by Renee's visit. He noted that she was a rather strange girl. However, he was incredibly grateful to her for the fee. He was surprised when she called him man. He thought she was a human being herself, but she was not. She only had the appearance of a human being. She was a homunculus monster. Sometime later, Renee finally reached the Tower of Mages. At the entrance, she said that she wanted to sell gems, and she was offered to meet with the head of their guild. Renee thanked them and followed the directions they gave her. One of the magicians volunteered to show her to the office, holding a lamp. He politely told Renee to follow him, and they began to climb the stairs high up. So now Renee learned that the office of the head of the Tower of Magicians was located at the top. As they climbed the stairs higher and higher, Renee thought that this building was very much like a dungeon in its structure. Finally, they arrived. The mage who had accompanied her all the way pointed to the door of the office of the head of the Tower of Mages. Renee entered the office. She was immediately greeted by the head of the tower, who was wearing a beautiful robe, and her head was covered with an interesting beret decorated with feathers. The head politely thanked her for Renee's visit. She introduced herself as the head of the Wing Mage Tower Guild, and her name was Gromit's Aimer. She then stood up, approaching Renee, and asked her to introduce herself. Renee said her name, but in a slightly different way. She said her name was Ren, and she noted for herself that Gromit's Aimer had quite a large supply of mana. The head of the Tower of Mages said that when she was informed that a child was waiting to meet her, she first thought not to even react to it. But the guard said that this child brought a huge amount of stones. She asked that Renee must have heard a lot about the Wing Tower of Magicians. She said that she hoped the stones she had brought were of high quality, befitting the status of their tower. Renee untied the pouch and poured all the stones on the table in front of Gromit's Aimer, inviting her to decide whether they were worthy. Gromit's Aimer was shocked by the value of all the stones. Her eyes sparkled at the beauty. She saw that all of the stones were grade A gems. Taking one in her hands, the head of the Tower of Magicians noted that some of the stones were of the highest quality. She wondered how such a young girl could have gotten such stones. Gromit's Aimer could not understand who this child was who came to her. She asked where she was from. But then the head of the Tower of Magicians saw Renee's peculiarly colored hair bursting out from under the hood of her robe. Among the 8 great families of the Empire, there was one that had inherited a special silver shade of hair. So it turns out that the daughter of this family ran away from home and took the gems with her. Gromit's Aimer could not find any other explanation for the young girl's wealth. In any case, she is a noblewoman, and most likely she does not even know the true value of those stones. Gromit's Aimer apologized for her earlier rudeness, as she did not think the stones would be in such good condition. She added that they would like to buy all of them. She offered 50 ounces of gold for each stone. And for the highest quality stones, they would offer a special price of 80 ounces of gold. Renee asked if they would really pay 50 ounces of gold for each stone. She remembered what the shopkeeper had said about how commoners would have to work hard for 10 years to get one of these stones. She knew that an average person earns about 10 ounces of gold in a year. Therefore, she calmly told Gromit's Aimer that if she cheated on her payment, she would simply die. This stunned the head of the Wizarding Tower. The latter realized that she was not dealing with a simple, dumb, clueless child, but rather a very knowledgeable girl who was well versed in the precious stones she had brought with her to sell. So she continued the conversation in a different tone and said that the guild did not have enough money to buy all these stones. Renee told them to buy as many as they could from her. Gromit's Aimer liked that. The head of the Mage Tower said that they had only 2,000 ounces of gold, and that was all they had. She then offered to exchange the rest of the stones not for gold, but for something else that was also valuable. Renee asked if Gromit's Aimer was sure of the value of the goods. After all, it should be easy to sell. The head of the Tower of Wizards replied that Renee should not even worry about it. She stood up from the table and invited the girl to follow her to inspect the items for the gem exchange. As they climbed the stairs, Gromit's Aimer said that, according to all the rules, outsiders were strictly forbidden to enter, but she would make an exception for her. Together they reached the treasury of the Wing Tower. Gromit's Aimer invited Renee to look at a tiara of 4 carats of diamonds with magic stones in the middle, which the magicians would definitely need. Then she showed the girl a live black pearl. This is a magical artifact. If poison appears somewhere near the person who wears the ring with this pearl, the ring will start to howl. She said that this ring was made with the help of alchemy. This did not sit well with Renee. She was not very interested in anything related to alchemy. Gromit's Aimer noticed this and asked if Renee really didn't like it. Well, of course, alchemy is an unsanitary science, so she understands Renee's aversion to it. So she brought Renee to another artifact in the form of a red heart and asked her what she thought of it. It was a red stone of love. It is said that this diamond makes love come true. Renee was breathless at the sight of this stone and what Gromit's Aimer said about it. She heard something that made her heart race. She could not refuse such a diamond. After all, this stone could attract the love of the creature she desired. Meanwhile, Gromit's Aimer continued that if she poured mana into this gem in the presence of someone she liked, an amazing thing would happen. The spirit that lives in the stone will establish eternal love between those two people. Renee stammered and asked if it was really between any two people, with trembling hands, taking such a valuable artifact, to which Gromit's Aimer replied that she had the word of the head of the Tower Guild. She asked Renee if she liked the stone. Renee answered without hesitation that she would take it without question. However, she warned the girl that this gem could also bring a lot of trouble, because it can even drown an emperor in the depths of adoration. Therefore, in her opinion, it is difficult to set a price for such a thing. Renee gritted her teeth, realizing what Gromit's Aimer was getting at. She held out to the head of the Tower of Wizards a thing that had stunned her. She stunnedly asked Renee where she had gotten this thing. After all, she had already received some money for some stones. Now Renee pulled her blade on Gromit's Aimer. Eventually, Gromit's Aimer gave Renee the heart-shaped diamond. One of the magicians asked her if she had really done it, and the head of the Tower of Magicians replied that it was no big deal. The magician could not calm down and continued to ask if Gromit's Aimer understood what could happen to the girl who got her hands on that diamond. He added that it would not be long before she died. But Gromit's Aimer was completely indifferent to what might happen to Renee. She admired the stones now that she was in possession of them. She added that the petty noblewoman had wanted the stones herself. She looked at the newly acquired stone and consoled herself that it was indeed very valuable. The magician did not let up and continued his story. Gromit's Aimer told him not to worry in vain because the girl would die as soon as it was released. She noted that the girl's loved one would also die, so there would be no evidence of the crime. Meanwhile, Renee, holding what she thought was a valuable treasure, returned to her dungeon. Finally, she reached her home. Then she went to Castle Chates in one of the 7 dungeons of Great Evil. Renee sat calmly in front of the mirror in the room of Mrs. Battery, who was cutting her hair and removing the damaged ends. She apologized to her for such an unexpected visit. She also apologized for constantly causing her trouble. Miss Bathory replied that she did not see anything wrong with that, and that neighbors should help each other. She is also very pleased to see and accept Renee's strength. In the end, if a person is beautiful, then all the works will be the same. Miss Bathory said that she sometimes envies Renee for being a homunculus. After all, in this case, her face will never age and will always remain young. Renee replied that Miss Bathory looks very young herself, and her skin is much clearer than her own. Mrs. Bathory said that she used a lot of blood to keep her skin beautiful. She was a vampire. Then she finished the hairdressing and took off Renee's cape. Renee wanted to ask Miss Bathory one more question. She wanted to know what Renee looked like to her. Miss Bathory replied that she thought she was by far the most charming person she had seen in a long time. This amused Renee. Mrs. Bathory leaned into the girl, assuring her that this was true. She touched her little nose and told her that no one would dare to say no to someone like her. Renee giggled at this pleasantness. Then Mrs. Bathory asked who the girl was trying so hard and dressing up for. She asked if Renee wanted to confess something to someone. Renee repeated Miss Bathory's last word and said that she did want to confess something to someone. She pulled out her heart-shaped stone, which she had exchanged for precious stones in the Magician's Guild. She happily announced that she would definitely confess. This answer surprised Miss Bathory, because she thought she was just joking when she asked this question. Now, she was obviously interested in who Renee was going to be married to. Renee answered lovingly that she was going to confess to Mr. Swallow. This worried Miss Bathory, and she said that Renee had a very good sense of humor. She wondered if it was because she was a homunculus. But Renee said that it was not a joke at all, and she was determined to confess her feelings to Mr. Swallow today. Miss Bathory took her head in her hands and asked the girl what she liked about him anyway. After all, there was nothing to like about him. But Renee argued that Mr. Swallow had a lot of great qualities. For example, he is reliable. Miss Bathory agreed. Mr. Swallow was indeed reliable. But he was also incredibly lazy. Then Renee, with her hands clasped in front of her, tastefully added the qualities of her lover that she also found very nice. He was lazy and big. He also ate obscenely much. He also slept and snored all the time. Mrs. Bathory listened to this and eventually asked why Renee's heart, knowing all this, was still drawn to Mr. Swallow. Renee replied that despite all of his shortcomings, she loved him very much. She really likes him, she is very sure of that. Miss Bathory wished Renee well in that case, but added that she thought she deserved much more. And if he turned her down, she shouldn't be upset, because Mrs. Bathory would always be happy to console her. Renee blushed at the offer, but thanked the vampire sincerely. She clutched her heart-shaped stone tightly in her palms, pressing it to her chest and encouraging herself. She kept repeating to herself that she would succeed, that she would be able to do it, that she would finally be able to confess. Meanwhile, something was happening in the Empire's capital, Riaz. A meeting was taking place in the joint command center of the dungeon raids. One of the attendees reported that they had some information about the team of the hero Bern Hestalt. The speaker added that the data indicated that the team was considered destroyed. No one wanted to believe this terrible news. The speaker was attacked with shouts that he himself had said that Bern's team had easily defeated the doorman of one of the dungeon entrances. Others also argued that the bodies had not yet been found, so how could he claim such a horrific outcome in an unprecedented way? No one believed that Bern could have been killed by any monsters. Everyone said that it was not true because the core of antiquity is not a large and intricate dungeon. You can go through it in a day or simply not return from there. There is no other way. And no one has received any news for the second day in a row. There is a bad assumption that Bern is no longer among the living. The commander-in-chief agreed with this terrible idea, but they had no other explanation for the lack of any information. Then he asked what was known about the sword of the Hestalt family. The speaker said that after the group infiltrated the core of antiquity, contact with them was lost. So nothing will be known until someone goes into that dungeon again. But it is unlikely that anyone will be able to take the 14th masterpiece, Tannabella. Sadly, everyone has to accept this. But others could not just accept it. They said that they needed to get that sword back as soon as possible. Some argued that it was impossible. Even Bern's team could not pass the core of antiquity. We cannot increase the number of victims. It was better to abandon the idea altogether. There was an argument that they had no right to give up so easily. If Bern fought the boss, then most likely the boss was seriously injured. After all, Bern is a real hero. After all, even while they are talking here, the boss is recovering his strength, and the dungeon is recovering with him. They need to end it all as soon as possible, before the boss regenerates completely. The commander-in-chief has his hands full, as the Imperial family has already lost their favorite hero, as well as one of their 36 masterpieces. If the second raid failed, they would all die. On the other hand, if they left things as they were, they would certainly anger the Imperial family and pay the price. The commander-in-chief was frantically searching for a solution, and it seems that he came up with one. He thought about what if Bern hadn't been able to inflict a single wound on the boss of the ancient nucleus, and his team couldn't damage the dungeon at all. In that case, it wouldn't matter how many more raids they sent there. He said in a low voice that the core of antiquity was impossible to conquer. Suddenly, all those sad thoughts were interrupted by someone's voice, which asked him directly why everyone had decided so. He confidently stated that he believed it was possible to conquer the core of antiquity. It was a representative of the Imperial magic community. The commander-in-chief was very surprised that he had come to their meeting. The representative of the Imperial magical community said that everyone probably knew whose instructions they were following. The commander-in-chief was worried that the emperor himself had already begun to intervene in the matter. This did not bode well. The representative of the Imperial magical community said that their visit meant one thing. It was time to pay for their sins. How foolish they had been to allow the precious hero of the empire to be destroyed. Moreover, they left one of the masterpieces in the center of the dungeon. The representative of the Imperial magical community continued, smashing everyone to pieces. He said that they all miscalculated the whole thing. But if they continue to behave like this, the question arises as to who will lead the next raids. And so the Imperial magical community offered the Emperor their own solution, and it can save their miserable souls. They suggested that they go through the core of antiquity again. Everyone objected that even Byrne himself could not cope with that task. So what can we say about all of them, who are not such heroes at all? The representative of the Imperial magical community named only one name, Nifrim. Then he repeated that it was Nifrim who would go with them. This caused general concern among those in the room. The commander-in-chief asked if they were in a hurry to send Nifrim. After all, it was with him that everything ended in failure, and he had too many problems. The representative of the Imperial magical community said that Nifrim was not a failure in this situation, but rather a certain success. And yet, according to the representative, there is one question. And he eloquently slammed his palm on the table in front of the commander-in-chief's face. How would he explain the fact that the hero Byrne and his team were unable to get out of the core of antiquity? He wondered if the whole team was weak, if they had let their guard down while in the dungeon. Now the representative of the Imperial magical community defiantly sat down on the edge of the table, with his back to everyone, put his foot up, and, as if to himself, listed possible options for the defeat of Byrne's team. He muttered that no, it was all completely out of the question. What then could have caused such a terrible defeat? What? He continued to think out loud, and he said that Byrne and his team had a clear problem. He raised his finger up and said that this was the only problem. The concrete hero was sorely lacking in one quality, namely the one that Nifrim, who is now a prisoner, possesses. And he added that this raid with Nifrim would definitely be successful. Meanwhile, at the core of antiquity, Sullo was feeling rather ill. He said that he had a bad feeling, like something really bad was coming. He sneezed loudly. Maybe it was some kind of infection spreading through the dungeon. It was hard for him to move. He was like a squeezed lemon, but they didn't know for sure when the humans would decide to attack them again. And he knew that Patrick would scold him again if he delayed his patrol. Patrick undoubtedly inspires incredible fear, even though he is made entirely of bones. Fallow, lying exhausted on the floor, repeated to himself that bones inspire incredible fear, and laughed to himself as he realized it. Then the dungeon boss stood up and decided to give up on any additional problems that might arise. He remembered that last time people invaded through a contaminated path. So that's where he needed to start. He visited the doorman of the core of antiquity, who had been guarding the right path to the dungeon so far, the Lord of 16 Tentacles. Looking around the battlefield and noting all the terrible wounds Mr. 16 Tentacles had suffered, Swallow thought that, of course, he was sorry for what had happened, but there was nothing he could do about it. He could only wait for the body to regenerate. He walked slowly through the dungeon, wondering how to proceed. So he came to Anthropophago, the manager of the 5th room. Anthropophago looked like a huge plant that grew everywhere. This monster is able to regenerate on its own as long as it has its main body and nutrients. Sullivan walked to the center of the Anthropophago to see if its body was still intact. When he saw that it was, he calmed down and decided not to interfere. His journey through the dungeon continued. He looked around the battlefield to see all the losses they had suffered and to fix things up if possible. Since everything was calm near room 5, it was obvious where the dungeon had been under the most attack. Swallow noted that rooms 1 through 4, inclusive, had suffered the most and were destroyed. He decided to discuss his research with Patrick, and scratching the back of his head, he added that Patrick would scold him again. He decided to deal with everything else later. For now, he went to rest. He realized that he had only examined the dirt path and the 5th room, but for that alone, he praised himself. With his hands in his pockets, he calmly walked to his resting place, mentally hoping that Patrick would understand. And just as the dungeon boss decided that he would calm down and get some sleep, he heard a noise. He saw someone's sword breaking through the dungeon walls. He was seized with furious anger. He realized that he would have to postpone his rest for a while. The dungeon was once again being trodden by human feet. This made Swallow very angry. He began to transform into a monster, and he said with dissatisfaction that the vile people decided to defile the dungeon with their presence in vain. He continued to threaten people that they would not get out of here alive. And suddenly he stopped talking when he saw someone approaching him. He stared stupidly ahead, scratching the back of his head and not realizing what was really happening. Renee was approaching him. She apologized for the unexpected visit. She said that she thought the dungeon had been invaded by the scum of the earth again. They met. Swallow asked with disappointment if it was her, and Renee kept repeating her apologies. The dungeon boss said that everything was fine, that he was just a little scared because he thought people were invading them again. And then Sullivan noticed that Renee was dressed very nicely. He complimented her. Renee blushed at that. She was very pleased that the person she had dressed up for had noticed all her efforts. Swallow feverishly began to ask if there was a special celebration or important event coming up. After all, Renee had taken off her maid's uniform. And the dungeon boss even thought that she intended to quit even earlier than Patrick. The homunculus girl began to wrap her hair excitedly around her finger. She said that something really important was coming up. She asked if Mr. Swallow could give her some of his time. The dungeon boss was thinking that she was going to ask to be fired. Renee asked him to follow her a little further and led him to her secret place, where there was a table and 2 chairs covered with a tablecloth. She invited him to sit at the table and began to prepare tea. Swallow kept repeating to himself like a mantra that Renee would not ask him to leave. Renee also sat down at the table and said that only she knew about this place where they were now, and now Mr. Swallow knows. The dungeon boss was still tormented by the thought of firing the maid. He began to drink a little tea, but the same thoughts did not recede. Meanwhile, Renee began to talk about why she had organized all this. She said that it had been 80 years since he, Mr. Swallow, had taken her into the dungeon. The dungeon boss did not fully comprehend what Renee was saying because he had only one thought in his mind. Renee continued her story. Swallow looked thoughtfully into his teacup and saw his reflection there. He said that he remembered when he hired Renee. It was 80 years ago that people started raiding. There were constant bloody battles, and more than 1,000 dungeons were destroyed to the ground. And the number of people who penetrated the core of antiquity exceeded several thousand. Everyone wanted to conquer that world. Renee bravely defended her territory, repelled all human attacks, and since then one nickname has stuck with her. Swallow began to recall all this. He said that she had done a very good job then. He asked how her right eye was doing now. Mentally, he sighed that Renee hadn't brought up the issue of her dismissal. Renee said that the dungeon boss still remembered her eye. This was a great indicator for her. She was happy about that. Swallow crossed his arms over his chest, leaned back, and said that of course he remembered. How could he not? Renee went on to say that she was very happy to be by his side all these years. The dungeon boss suddenly suspected something. He began to wonder what Renee was talking about. He was caught by the words that Renee was happy to be by his side. After all, in the East, these words are said mostly just before saying goodbye. Renee continued to speak. Once again, Swallow began to worry that the girl would ask him to leave. And then Renee finally decided to say what she had started all this for. She told Mr. Swallow that she liked him. The dungeon boss was stunned by this turn in the conversation. Renee repeated with a loving look what she had already admitted, namely that she liked Mr. Swallow very much. Folding her hands together, she shyly began to say that she had been waiting for this moment for all these 80 years. Because of all this excitement, the dungeon boss began to transform from a man into a monster. He wanted to clarify something for himself, but he didn't know where to start. Swallow scratched the back of his head, and all he could manage was to say that he was very grateful to Renee for her feelings. He added that they are constantly at the crossroads of life and death here. Solo continued that none of them know when they are going to be injured, and even more so, they don't know when they are going to die. He said that she probably didn't want any of them to spend the rest of their lives alone. Renee clenched her fists and thought in disappointment that this was the answer she had been afraid of. She knew from the beginning that she was asking for the impossible. But she had told Mr. Swallow that beyond all that, she could not keep her feelings quiet forever. Sooner or later she would have to confess to him. At this point, Renee stood up, turned toward the exit, and said that she would be extremely offended if the dungeon boss rejected her confession and turned away from her. But this would cause her immense pain and she would not be able to survive it. The girl pulled out a heart-shaped magic stone and said that she wanted to get the boss's love in any way she could. Any way, no matter what. She overturned the table with the cups, scaring Mr. Swallow with this behavior, and rushed right at him. Renee shouted in his face that she was ready to resort to even the most despicable ways to make him fall in love with her. Mr. Swallow asked her not to get so hot and bothered, to wait a while to calm down. She showed the dungeon boss a red heart-shaped stone and said that with it, her dream had at least some chance of coming true. Swallow looked at the artifact Renee was holding in fright. He realized that she could easily use his power for her own personal purposes, despite his wishes. And this was no joke at all. Meanwhile, Renee continued. She said that the stone just needed a little mana to activate its effect. The girl summoned her mana and began to pour it on the stone. The dungeon boss was very angry. He roared and attacked Renee, saying that she must be planning to kill him. Renee did not understand why he was so angry. After all, she had only wanted to use the stone to bewitch Swallow to her. She frantically asked him what was wrong. She wanted to justify herself by saying that she hadn't even intended to do so. With a single blow, Swallow smashed the heart-shaped stone that Renee cherished so much and on which she had placed great expectations. Suddenly Patrick came running in. He said that everything was fine. It is not the king's business to drive people out of the dungeon, but it was okay to kick Renee in the neck. He was running around the boss and asking where his conscience was, how to hear him. Patrick stopped and began to mock that the dungeon boss could not distinguish Renee from the miserable blacks, and he, Patrick, can't even stop his jaw from dropping in shock. Finally, Swallow stopped being angry. He sat down looking at Patrick. He held his head and began to ask the skeleton for advice on what he should do. Patrick mockingly replied that the problem was created by the boss himself, and now he was looking for a solution from him. So let him get out of it himself. The skeleton was holding a piece of a magical artifact, a heart-shaped stone brought by Renee from the Mage Guild, and was planning something. Patrick clenched his fists, and the shard shattered into small pieces. He said that not just one boss was to blame for what happened. But that didn't absolve him of responsibility for what happened to him, to Patrick. He walked closer to the boss and lifted his ears, asking why he was covering them. The boss started asking what happened to Patrick, because he didn't remember anything like that. But something very strange began to happen to Swallow. Patrick shouted excitedly to him to calm down, that everything would be fine. Strange things continued to happen to the boss. He began to transform into a man, then suddenly back into a monster and back into a man again. Patrick was screaming frantically, asking what was happening, what was going on here. Renee, meanwhile, was sitting by the broken heart-shaped stone with a frantic look on her face, wondering what had happened. Patrick started shouting at her to come to her senses, to leave the boss to him, and to run away as fast as she could to save herself. But he knew perfectly well that in that whole atmosphere she couldn't hear him at all. She was under the influence of the split stone. So Patrick decided to take matters into his own hands, because he saw that there was no other way out of the situation. To save Renee from her boss, Patrick had to force her away from him. Otherwise, she would have been hurt. Renee fell unconscious quite a distance away. Patrick apologized for being so rude to her, but he had no choice. Now he could start dealing with the boss without any problems. The dungeon boss got even angrier when he saw what Patrick was doing. He roared loudly at what he was going to do next. He shouted if Patrick wanted to kill him too, and he hit him on the skull. Patrick covered himself. Finally, things calmed down a bit, and the skeleton asked the boss if he still remembered anything. The boss held his head and mumbled that he did remember something. He began to apologize to Patrick for what was happening. They both sat down. Patrick gently patted his boss on the side and said that he was glad that Sullivan had immediately admitted his guilt. He added that he fully understood why he had done so and how everything had happened. The skeleton realized, looking at the broken stone fragments, that the dungeon boss was acting under the influence of a magical artifact, not of his own free will. He knew that Swallow was just defending himself because he was afraid that Renee was going to harm him. The boss said that it would be a good idea to look for Renee now. Patrick asked if the boss could not have thought of a more intelligent question. Swallow replied that he was afraid that Patrick would talk him out of it. But the skeleton said, how could the boss assume such a thing? What kind of opinion does he have of him? After all, they both realize that they really need the homunculus girl. After all, she gets food for everyone, manages the diets of other monsters, cleans and restores the dungeon, replenishes the dungeon with monsters, and reinstalls traps in it. In addition to all this, she consults and resolves complaints in each room, turns loot into gold, and handles income distribution and accounting. Patrick listed all of this. He said that Renee has always done all of this, and in the end he added that it would be more critical for their dungeon if Renee disappeared, not the boss of the Swallow. The boss, of course, agreed. He said he knew all this well himself. So Patrick told him to make sure the boss found the girl before it was too late. He told him to do whatever he wanted, whatever came to mind, but to bring her back. The methods didn't matter. Let him kneel down in front of her or sob with incredible sadness. He can even kiss her feet, but he must bring her back to them. Swallow nodded his head in agreement. Then Patrick held something out to the boss and told him to take it with him. The boss looked at what he was holding with interest. Patrick said that this thing was called a demura. It helps to keep the balance of mana. It looks like a black bracelet with a green stone. The skeleton added that Swallow shouldn't worry about the details, but let him know that this thing is very expensive. The boss gently took the bracelet with 2 fingers and asked what it was. Patrick replied that he really didn't know if the bracelet would work on the boss. He also noticed that he had 6 fingers on his hand again. Then he added that even if this artifact was not very useful, at least it would help him transform in a decent way. Swallow stepped away from the skeleton. He said that it irritated him. He complained that Patrick seemed to know everything that was going to happen in advance and had carefully prepared for it. He asked where he had gotten the thing. Patrick replied that he had just picked it up on the road. The skeleton also emphasized that Swallow should use the bracelet for its intended purpose, because it is quite fragile. The dungeon boss put the bracelet on his hand, looked at it suspiciously, wondering how it could help. He hummed to himself, and Patrick wished him luck. Leaving Patrick, Swallow repeated several times that he would try to follow the instructions, and he temporarily handed over control of the dungeon to the skeleton until he was there. Patrick laughed at him, saying that he was going on a picnic. But strictly, without any jokes, he added that the boss must return within 5 days, because the time was coming when people would attack again. Swallow asked if he really needed to return before the next raid and received an affirmative answer. Patrick is afraid that he won't be able to survive without his boss, and he's even scared to think what might happen if people get to that place. That's why he clearly emphasized several times that it was only about 5 days. 5 days and no more. This is not negotiable. Let the dungeon boss not be forgotten in his quest. Swallow only grunted that he agreed, and finally left the room, from which Renee's homunculus disappeared in an unknown direction. The dungeon boss finally said that he would definitely return in 5 days with Renee. Patrick shouted after him that if he went to the city he should behave normally, because if people recognize him as a monster, nothing good will come of it, and everything would go wrong. Once again, Swallow agreed with Patrick's warnings and went in search of the maid Renee. And then the dungeon boss smiled cynically and said that if things didn't go according to his plan, he would simply kill everyone. And Patrick said to himself that everything was much more complicated than it seemed at first glance. Patrick opened the latest newspaper published by humans and read the news that the 34th masterpiece of the 36 masterpieces, The Teeth of Dandu, had been sold at auction. So the skeleton wondered where Renee could have left the Dandu teeth, since she brought a demon's stone instead. She almost died at the hands of her boss because of her stupid prank. At this point, Patrick must have guessed where Renee was selling the 34th masterpiece, and he thought that he wished that Swallow hadn't guessed it. He imagined the picture of the dungeon boss devouring everyone who crossed his path when he found out the truth. Patrick screamed at the thought. It could lead to a real apocalypse, but now is definitely not the time to destroy the whole world. It would definitely have to wait. That's what the skeleton thought, hiding the newspaper away from his eyes. But then by chance his eyes came across another article that stunned him. This article said that the Joint Dungeon Raid Command Center was going to pass the core of antiquity within 3 days. Patrick remembered that he and his boss had discussed the time to find Renee, and the conversation had been about 5 days, just 5 days, that's what they agreed to, and so that the boss would not be forgotten. And here in the article it is written that in 3 days another dungeon raid will be carried out. What should he do in this case? It could be a disaster. Patrick frantically thought of ways to solve the problem that was brewing. He realized that Swallow might not be able to return in time for the humans to start attacking the ancient core again. In the meantime, the dungeon boss came to the surface, but he was not happy with his arrival because he fell to the ground. In addition, he landed in the wrong place again, where he had originally planned to arrive. Swallow remembered Patrick's instructions that he should not use magic because his mana was very unstable. The dungeon boss looked at his hand, noticed his mana level, and realized that it was because he was out of balance. But he decided to gather his strength, because it was too early to give up, because everything was just beginning, and try again. He started using his unstable mana again. He set the direction to the City of Parts and waited for the spell to work. For some reason, he decided that this was where Renee had gone to sell sword gems. Something important was happening in the dungeon. The men of the next raid had gone too far. Here, on a majestic throne, sat the Queen of Demons, a descendant of the 17th generation of Asmodeus, Melju de Rimph Agrea. She addressed the people with the words that she would grant them a glorious death today. Instead, the commander of the group of people who came to conquer the dungeon said that all this sounded very ridiculous. He asked how the demon could be so sure. He went on to say that they all made up the 32nd elite raid group in the Empire's ranking. With his sword in front of him, the commander added that they were the Huangho at Dawn Warriors. He prepared for the attack and told the queen to remember this name because they would be the ones to dethrone her and thus become famous throughout the continent. This made the queen even angrier, and she decided to immediately deal with the insolent men on the spot. She began to rise from her throne, once again reminding the attackers who she was, and that joking with her was inappropriate. The demon queen, a descendant of the 17th generation of Asmodeus, shouted a spell and directed all her anger at the people. She spoke menacingly so that they would all be proud to know her name and die at last. Instead, the leader of the group rushed at her with a sword, shouting that the words she had just spoken to them applied to her, the demon queen. The archers pelted Queen Melja de Rimph Agrea with arrows, which simply bounced off her. People thought about this because they saw that ordinary arrows did not cause the demon queen a single scratch. They had to think of something to defeat her. One of the warriors shouted to the commander to give him support. The demon queen was seriously furious. She counterattacked the people, calling them miserable humans who did not know their place. She created a real hell around them and shouted at them that they were going to burn alive. People were afraid of such strong magic because they had no powerful defense against it. Suddenly, they saw that the fire was being fed by ice from somewhere. This surprised them. They did not know what was going on. The commander looked up and shouted in amazement, "Can this be possible?"
and it was the demon queen, Meljudarimf Agreya, who had already prepared the next deadly spell for people, ice. Meanwhile, the demon queen raised her scepter high with which she created and directed various spells. A very difficult battle was going on. People realized that they could not do anything against these spells. The demon queen was furious. She shouted to the commander of the human squad that he really wanted to die so quickly, and she had not even had time to warm up. The queen laughed, wondering what kind of people they were now. But then suddenly her spell shattered against the shield. The demon queen was shocked when the shield appeared in front of the commander. She was surprised to hear that she had already killed the mana of the human squad. So how could a magical shield appear? The people, encouraged by the success of their commander, shouted words of support, motivating him to make new attacks on Queen Meljudarimf Agreya. The demon queen became even more angry. Calling people undersized, she tried to create new spells to kill the leader of the raid. The commander and Queen Meljudarimf Agreya faced off in another fight, and no one knew for sure who would win. Suddenly the demon queen screamed in terror and began to fall backwards, retreating. The force of the blows threw the opponents away from each other. They were both very exhausted, but the battle had to go on. The soldiers ran up to their commander, asking if he could get up, to which the leader replied that he could, that he was fine and ready to continue fighting. He asked his men who it was that came to help them. He hadn't heard anything about another group joining them. The demon queen also noticed that the people were getting support. She was very disappointed. After all, if their strength is enough to destroy her castle, things are very bad. In the dust and darkness, she could not see who else had arrived on the battlefield, but that someone began to destroy the walls of the queen's castle. Everyone was surprised to hear that the newcomer began to ask them something, as if he did not understand where he was. The question asked by the stranger threw everyone off track, because he asked if anyone could tell him where the city of Haston was. Both the warriors of the raid and the demon queen, Meljudarimf Agreya, did not even know what to say. The newcomer's question was so unexpected. They all just stood there in a stupor for a while. Then they all attacked him with accusations that not only had he come here from nowhere, but that he was talking nonsense. And it was none other than the dungeon boss himself, Swallow. He was in the wrong place again. The people here noticed that he looked like a human and advised him to move away from the demon queen. To this, Swallow just scratched the back of his head and repeated the words demon queen after them. Meanwhile, Queen Meljudarimf Agreya prepared for another attack. She decided that another human was no threat to her at all. The dungeon boss, Swallow, thought about the fact that the demon queen's ancestors looked completely different. He continued to think that maybe it was all about generations. Meanwhile, the queen called the people premature embryos and shouted that they would pay for destroying her castle. Here she was addressing Swallow in the first place. She did not know who he really was. The warriors from the raid team told the queen that she would now experience for herself what it means to be destroyed by embryos. It seemed that support was approaching them. The people were very encouraged by this and said that now they all needed to finally finish off the demon queen. Still, Swallow tried to ask them what he needed to know. The people kept shouting at the queen to let her try to use her magic on them again, because it would not work on them anyway. The queen responded by shouting at them that they were talking too much and continued to call them scum of the earth. Only the boss of the dungeon weakly said the word Hastin, which he cherished now. The people fought hard, motivated by what they thought was the support of another group rushing to them. They were telling each other not to be afraid and to fight to the best of their abilities. Swallow was still hoping that someone would tell him how to get to the city of Haston. The demon queen was screaming, letting people fully experience the terrible pain, and people were shouting back at her, letting her feel the pain herself. The dungeon boss was losing hope of getting any advice from anyone. Eventually, he got fed up with it all and decided to just leave the place. He realized that he needed to find Renee as soon as possible, and here he would not know anything for sure.
Swallow also thought that Patrick would be very angry if he was late and didn't make it back in the 5 days they had agreed on. The warriors shouted at him to join in the battle against the Demon Queen, but they noticed that for some reason Swallow was leaving the battlefield. They decided that he was just scared and running away. The last remark made the dungeon boss very angry, and he rushed to attack the people. The soldiers, caught off guard by this turn of events, began to scatter screaming, and Swallow just killed them all in a row without sorting them out. Because they had angered him in particular, and they hadn't told him the information he needed so badly. And now he, satisfied with himself having defeated the entire raid group, silently left that place. The Demon Queen, Agrea, was incredibly shocked by what had just happened right before her eyes. She could not understand how that man had destroyed his own kind in the dungeon. After all, she had no idea who the man was. She was left alone with the dungeon boss, not knowing who he really was, as he was still in the form of a human, and asked him what had just happened. Agrea told him that she was very surprised by his powerful strength. And if she had calculated everything correctly, he was undoubtedly superior to her in terms of mana. The Demon Queen immediately said that she had many questions for him. She wanted to know as much about him as possible. She began to throw a lot of questions at him. Who was he? What was his name? What was that big thing he had? And what was under his cloak? What was his secret? Finally, she came to her senses and apologized for being so unceremonious. She remembered that she hadn't even introduced herself to the stranger yet. So she proudly said that she was a great demon queen, a descendant of the 17th generation of Asmodeus. And she said her name even more majestically, Agrea. After such a pompous introduction, she asked the name of the one who helped her win this battle. The boss of the dungeon was disgusted by the whole show. He hates it when someone shows off like that. But he needed to get some information, so he decided to be polite. And he was about to say his name, but he managed to say only Swall, but stopped in time. He abruptly interrupted himself to think about the situation properly. He remembered Patrick's words, that if he gave himself away quickly, unnecessary rumors would start. The skeleton had also asked him to be careful. He realized that there was no point in revealing his real name. So now he continued to say his name as it had been changed and added Dironi. He clearly realized that he was here only to find Renee. Swallow repeated his fake name in full. It sounded like Swaldroni. He said he was a man with a beautiful smile from some city. He was 32 years old and a bachelor. He immediately imagined such a white-toothed man, realized that he had said something very stupid, but at the moment nothing good came to his mind. The queen asked if she had heard correctly that his name was Swaldroni, and then she asked if she could just call him Swald, because it was much easier. The dungeon boss replied that he had no problem with that. The queen said that everything was fine and said that first of all, she had to thank him for his invaluable help. However, she added that he had also destroyed half of her castle. Swallow felt uncomfortable with that statement. But Agrea replied that it was just fine, because if it wasn't for him, she would have been the one to suffer. The dungeon boss said that he wasn't even going to be much help in the end. The Demon Queen readily said that she was now in his debt. She asked how she could repay him, how she could help him. Swallow immediately jumped at this offer of help and said that there was something he needed to know, namely how to get to Haston. The Demon Queen repeated the request after him, and it seemed to Swallow that she knew the way to that city. The dungeon boss was already glad to have come to the right place. He thought that he had saved the Demon Queen for a reason and was already approaching his Renee in his thoughts. And then all his illusions burst like soap bubbles. For Agrea shouted in surprise at who Haston was. Swallow's mind was racing with thoughts as to why the queen had asked that question. He concluded that she not only didn't know how to get there, she had no idea what Haston was. The dungeon boss was disappointed to think that he had gone so far with the unbalanced power of his magic that they didn't even know about the existence of a city like Haston. Then he decided to ask something simpler, namely where the nearest town was. The queen wondered which city was closest to her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she answered that the nearest city would probably be Riaz. Swallow asked if she was sure about Riaz. Did she really mean Riazi, the capital of the Riazi Empire? The dungeon boss realized that it would take 2 months to travel from the empire's capital to Haston if he traveled on horseback. Falling feebly to the floor, the demon queen asked him what had happened to him, what had upset him so much, what was making him so anxious. The dungeon boss replied that he was unfortunately very far from his ultimate goal. Melju de Rimph Agrea said that if he was very far away and didn't need to go to the capital at all, he could use the teleportation center. Swallow was surprised at what the demon queen was offering him because he had never heard of teleportation centers. The demon queen explained that this creation was created by humans using alchemy. It is said that this magic device forcibly creates the magic of movement in space. This cheered up the dungeon boss a bit, and he asked where the teleportation center was located. Now, Swallow and the demon queen had moved to the center of the capital of the Riaze Empire. It was a great place to gather information. Once again, Wallow was sad, thinking that he was unlikely to find Renee here. But it was not a given that she had gone to Haston. So first, he needed to find out as much as possible. He said he was looking for a girl with silver hair. The demon queen told him not to worry too much and offered to help him find the girl. The dungeon boss asked if she could just leave her castle and leave it unattended. The demon queen said that she was certainly flattered that he was so worried about her, but to let him be calm about it. She said that she was a demon queen, a supreme being created to rule. The shape of the dungeon does not matter in this case. Any place she is in becomes a haven for monsters, and they are her army. Swallow clarified what this means, whether this is the ability of demon kings. He also asked if she could call her warriors to help her at any time. To this, Melj de Rimph Agrea replied that this was the case, and she immediately added that she had never actually tried it. But she clearly knows that her father could summon demons, which means that she can do it too. Swallow was a little suspicious of this application. The demon queen drooped a little as some memories came flooding back to her. Something was bothering her now. She said that the castle where she lived and which her father had built was now completely destroyed, and there was absolutely no point in her returning there. The dungeon boss felt guilty about this because he was involved in the destruction of her castle. But the queen continued that the condition of the castle was far from good anyway. It was constantly being attacked by people. They attacked it with no concern for the damage caused. Meanwhile, Swallow and Melju de Rimph Agrea were already walking through the streets of the city. The demon queen added that it was quite difficult when the capital of the human empire was located right in front of the castle. Suddenly, the queen interrupted her sad thoughts out loud and said that she had complained enough and they needed to go collect evidence. At this point, Swallow agreed that he had to continue on his way in search of Renee. He wondered where to go next. Finally, he realized that he would not continue his search alone, but in the company of the demon queen. They went to a coffee shop and ordered 2 beers. Thus, the dungeon boss finally realized that Melju de Rimph Agrea had decided to join him. But a visit to a coffee shop was not part of his plans. So he watched Melju drink a mug of beer with gusto and began to hint to her that they had a completely different purpose in that city. The queen drank low-alcohol drinks again and again, saying that they were wonderfully refreshing. Then she turned to Swallow and said that he seemed to have no idea how human cities are formed. The demon queen said that the bar was a place of accumulation of information. She suggested that he look around and listen to what all those people were talking about. She also told Meljo de Rimph Agrea to listen carefully to those conversations, especially now. It's just a true source of information. At every table, people are talking about everything and everyone. The demon queen summarized that Sallow would only have to filter everything he heard and take into account only what he needed. The dungeon boss realized what it was all about, but he hadn't yet figured out where the information he needed could come from. In the coffee shop, there was a large bulletin board on the wall. The owners posted all sorts of messages and small articles to keep their customers informed about what was happening in their empire
and in the city in particular. Swallow and the Demon Queen saw this board and decided to take advantage of it. Melju de Rimphagrea said that this is also the source of information that everyone needs, and now they need it too. The dungeon boss did not understand anything about the board. What could be so valuable about it? Then they saw that the board had sheets with lists of teams that would take part in the raids. The Demon Queen said she had heard that this was done to prevent several different groups from going through the same dungeon. Swallow and Melju de Rimphagrea wondered if this made sense, since they had never had multiple groups invade them at the same time before. The Queen added that otherwise there would be problems with the distribution of rewards. The Demon Queen thought how inexperienced people were in this regard, because if several groups joined forces, the chances of passing the dungeon would increase many times over, and they were just stuck in their greed. And here, Sullivan almost blurted out that he wasn't really human. She began to question whether he was a dungeon monster like her, and in general who he was. After all, she, the ruler of the castle, can really walk the streets freely. And how can he move around as freely here? Swallow just turned away and said that he was lazy. That is, it was difficult to explain everything. He suggested that the Queen simply forget about it all. To this, Melj de Rimphagrea replied that he had too many secrets, but she would not bother him with her questions. She wisely said that she believed he had his reasons. Then among the lists, Swallow saw a piece of paper with his house on it, but he was comforted by the fact that the list was now empty. This meant that he still had some time. The Demon Queen was also curious about what Swallow was thinking about, what list he was paying special attention to. He was about to tear off that piece of paper, and Melj de Rimphagrea asked him to show her what was written there. She even said that he was bragging about his great position, which was unfair to her. Then the dungeon boss let her read what was written on that piece of paper. The Demon Queen read that it was about one of the 7 dungeons of great evil, the core of antiquity. She was very surprised. The dungeon boss asked her if she knew about this dungeon, and the Queen replied that of course she did. These are the 7 dungeons of great evil. The core of antiquity is the greatest of all the dungeons, whose incredible power has been recognized even by foolish men. Suddenly, Swallow asked if they had the right to take that piece of paper off the board, and the Demon Queen continued with her rule about the core of antiquity. She said that it was the goal of all monsters, because among the 7 dungeons it is the strongest. There lives a powerful lord of all things, the ruler of the core of antiquity. Melju de Rimphagrea continued to sing the praises of the ruler of the core of antiquity. She said that he was God's guardian, who punished the intimidated. He was an ancient monster standing on top of everyone and everything. Here the Demon Queen finally uttered the name of that monster, Swallow, with incredible enthusiasm and acquisition. The dungeon boss humbly lowered his head over his drink mug and thought that he was really just a host, not a ruler who was also suffering from the evil inhabitants. The Demon Queen continued to be enthusiastic and said that the core of antiquity was her favorite dungeon. She said she wanted to become even stronger herself. Melju de Rimphagrea thinks that if she becomes stronger and improves her abilities, she will be able to see Swallow himself. The dungeon boss feverishly thought that she was sitting next to him right now, looking at him. The Queen said that being the most powerful was so wonderful, and she asked Swallow if he agreed. Then she added that she aspired to be the same. She went on to say that her father was also strong. He was a worthy demon king, not like her. It's just that at that time there were people who were stronger than him. That's why he was driven out now. And one of these human heroes was Burn, or as everyone called him, the quite young hero. The dungeon boss asked if he was the same hero who had defeated the Demon King. He added that he would not like to meet him, and in his head he was thinking that he had swallowed that hero Burn while he was yawning. The Demon Queen said that she didn't want to spend her whole life running a dungeon like her father. She just wants the monsters she attracts with her power to create their own dungeons. And so she will become stronger. That's her plan. She asked Swallow how he felt about it. Swallow agreed that it was really wonderful, and he thought to himself how young she was. He was immersed in memories that he had been like that once, too, and had such ambitions, but it was so long ago that he couldn't even remember it. After all, there were times when he led an army that was capable of dominating the entire world. Back then, he read a lot, researched, tried to master world knowledge more seriously than anyone else. Sometimes he even hung out with some people whom he despised and considered worthless. And then his ambitions and emotions took over and he followed them. And then he gave them everything. But in the end, he realized that this state of affairs would not lead to anything good. So now he just became lazy and wants to sleep. And that is the purpose of his life now. In his reflections, Swallow did not notice how the Demon Queen fell asleep with her head down on the table. He heard a specific sound of snoring from her. He wondered how she had gotten so tired so quickly. After taking a closer look, he was convinced that Melju de Rimphagrea had indeed fallen asleep peacefully. Then he heard someone shouting to the owner of the coffee shop that the dungeon was being raided again. But the owner replied that this was yesterday's information, he just forgot to take off that piece of paper. Everyone began to accuse the owner of how he could have let that happen and left that piece of paper behind. Everyone began to wonder what kind of dungeon he was talking about. At that time, Swallow threw the sleeping Demon Queen over his shoulder and approached the coffee shop owner and asked where he had restrooms. The coffee shop owner showed the dungeon boss where to go to the rooms, and he began to change the information on the bulletin board. Visitors kept attacking the coffee shop owner, asking why he hadn't done this all along, why he hadn't updated the information. And if the inspectors caught him, they would definitely write him a fine. The coffee shop owner replied that he would do everything quickly.